Hey student friends, and welcome to today's Explainer. Today, we're literally cracking open Prakaran 1, that's Chapter 1 of the Gujarat Board's social science curriculum, to uncover one of the most transformative periods in all of history. We're talking about the rise of British rule in India. We're going to take a chronological journey, tracing exactly how a small group of foreign merchants, who were basically just looking for spices, managed to completely take over an entire subcontinent. By the end of this, you won't just be memorizing dates for an exam, you're going to truly understand the grand chessboard of history.
So here's our roadmap for how this journey unfolds today. First up, the search for a new sea route. Second, the massive expansion of British power. Third, we'll break down the subsidiary and lapse policies. And finally, we'll look at the lasting economic and social impacts on the subcontinent.
All right, let's dive right into part 1, the new sea route and Europeans, starting with the fall of Constantinople. Now, you might be wondering, why on earth did Europeans suddenly need a brand new sea route to India in the 15th century? Well, for centuries, global trade flowed really smoothly over a reliable land and sea route that passed right through a vital city called Constantinople. Europe was practically addicted to Indian goods. I mean, our rich spices, pepper, silk, and muslin cloth. They were absolute necessities over there. But then, in 1453, a massive historical earthquake happened. The Turks conquered Constantinople, boom. Suddenly, that ancient trade route was completely blocked. The spices stopped flowing. The Europeans literally had no choice. They desperately needed a new way to reach India across the uncharted ocean. The solution? An absolutely incredible, daunting journey all the way around the vast continent of Africa. In 1498, Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama, actually with the vital help of an Indian sailor, successfully navigated past the perilous Cape of Good Hope and finally touched the shores of Calicut. The local king, Zamorin, welcomed him and granted permission to trade. Vasco da Gama had just unlocked the ultimate prize. The door to India's immense wealth was now wide open for Europe. And you know, the buildup happened incredibly fast. The Portuguese arrived first in 1498, but word of these massive profits spread like wildfire back to Europe. Fast forward a century, and Queen Elizabeth of England formally grants a charter to establish the British East India Company in 1600. By 1613, with Emperor Jahangir's blessing, the British secure their very first permanent trading post, or Kothi, right in Surat. Naturally, not wanting to miss out on the action, the French East India Company arrives on the scene in 1668. So now, the tension on the subcontinent is palpable. It's a crowded, highly competitive marketplace, and everyone wants a piece of the pie.
Which brings us to part 2, the expansion of British power, and establishing those crucial footholds. And this brilliantly illustrates just how intense the geographical reality of this power struggle was. The British established major strongholds across the board: Fort St. George down in Chennai, Fort William in Kolkata, and their western headquarters over in Mumbai. But the French and the Portuguese, they had their own heavily fortified spots too, like Pondicherry and Goa. Now, the British didn't want to share this wealth. This close proximity led to bitter, bloody conflicts, most notably the Carnatic Wars between the British and the French. Ultimately, the British emerged victorious, completely crushing French ambitions and clearing the ultimate path for their own expansion across all of India.
Let's move on to part 3, the subsidiary and lapse policies. Basically, they're strategies of annexation. These are some of the densest policies in the chapter, but don't worry, we're going to make them super easy to digest.
Basically, two key governor-generals used vastly different tactics to absorb independent Indian princely states. First, Lord Wellesley introduced the subsidiary alliance, which is often and very accurately called the sweet poison. On paper, it sounded like a fantastic deal for an Indian king, offering a highly trained British army for protection. But the terms were totally toxic. The king had to pay for this army's upkeep, host a British representative at his court, and completely surrender his right to make war or sign treaties. Kings were literally giving away their independence for a false sense of security. Contrast that with Lord Dalhousie's doctrine of lapse. Dalhousie was an aggressive imperialist. He didn't want to just control the kings. He wanted to completely erase their authority and directly annex their lands into the British Empire. Now, what's really interesting here is how Dalhousie applied his doctrine systematically and ruthlessly, using administrative trickery rather than just military might. If an Indian king died without a natural-born male heir, annexed, that is exactly how they took Jhansi, Satara, and Nagpur. Did the British claim his state was being mismanaged? Annexed, that was the tragic fate of Oudh. He even swallowed up states under the pretense of collecting unpaid debts or simply ending namesake authority. Dalhousie's sheer speed and utter disregard for Indian traditions created this deep, burning anger right across the subcontinent. Finally, we reach part 4, the economic and social impacts. This is truly a dual-sided legacy. Before the British, Indian villages were largely self-reliant, and our textiles were famous worldwide. But under company rule, India suffered a massive, one-way economic drain. The incredibly rich textile industry of Bengal was systematically destroyed through unjust tariffs on Indian cloth, while cheap British cloth just flooded the market entirely tax-free. They forced local Indian artisans into unfair, impossible contracts, and they literally beat or jail those who refused. In just a century, a wealthy manufacturing hub was reduced to a poverty-stricken supplier of raw materials. Farmers were crushed under debt, and artisans were left starving and completely unemployed. But, and here's the really complex flip side to this era, to manage this massive, sprawling empire, the British had to build modern infrastructure. They laid the very first railway line in India in 1853, connecting Mumbai to Thane, and they introduced telegraphs. Socially, with the vital help of visionary Indian reformers like Rajaram Mohan Roy, brutal practices like sati were officially abolished. Lord Macaulay introduced an English education system, now mostly just to create cheap clerical labor for themselves, and new universities were established in Mumbai, Chennai, and Kolkata. While this was meant entirely for British administrative convenience, it inadvertently sparked something amazing. English education connected thinkers across the country, giving them access to global ideas of democracy and actually uniting them against a common oppressor.
So, what does this all mean for us? We've just traced an incredible 100-year journey, from a simple trade permit back in the year 1600 to absolute, undeniable dominance over the Indian subcontinent by 1857. We've seen the sweet poison of those alliances, the aggressive land grabs, the crippling economic exploitation, and the sudden, jarring arrival of railways and modern education. So I want to leave you with this provocative question to ponder. Did a century of company rule, with all its greed, its ruin, and its accidental modernization, inevitably plant the seeds for the explosive Great Revolt of 1857? Keep that thought firmly in your mind as you study. Thanks for joining me on today's Explainer, and I'll see you next time.